There's still some salty language going on in the back.
Sorry. Sorry, Jeff.
Saltine? That's an interesting point.
Okay, we're all ready?
Yes.
Okay. So this is Appendix J. This is the decision analysis on Delta strategies. This is probably the talk that of this group that's been given the most times, in essence, because this is the talk that tries to put together all these pieces in a simple, understandable, yet comprehensive framework that is providing insights without rigor mortis. And I have to acknowledge, of course, all my co-equal authors here, without whom nothing would be possible. Just to revisit, we've talked some about water quality this morning. And I have to also mention that one of the water quality costs that we actually haven't factored in, very explicitly at least, is the urban salinity costs to folks that have less lifetime on their water heaters and in their plumbing systems because of salts coming in from the Delta. There are actually some very nice studies of this back in the 1990s. It's more of a problem for Southern California because they have fairly saline water, much more saline water they get from the Colorado River. So, and they blend these sources. So any reduction in salts that they get from the Sacramento side or from the Delta side will have some economic impacts and improvements down in the urban areas down there as well. I think much less so in the Bay Area, but we can go back and estimate some of those. So all these models are wrong, but some are useful. This is just to refresh us back to the first appendix presented last time on the delta levees, that the delta of tomorrow will be very different than the one we have today. We're going to see large bodies of open water and higher sea levels. There's pretty much time and tide wait for no man. Earthquakes will probably not wait for us either. This is what we're looking at in the future, something of this ilk. We will have increased salinity and we'll have increased habitat variability. This could be good for fish, or it could not, depending upon how we manage it and take advantage of it or don't. And it will certainly be bad for the water users and the water, particularly the urban and agricultural users, even if all the islands, by some miracle, remain intact. So on the water export side, this leaves us with a statewide problem of what strategy should we pursue in terms of long-term water exports. We've been relying on this water in recent years, up to 6 million acre foot per year. That's a large chunk of water, even in California. Fundamentally, there are only 4 strategies that you can take regarding delta water exports. You can continue with the current strategy of taking water through the delta, where almost all of it comes through the Sacramento River and then down and out southern delta. You have a peripheral canal of whatever alignment you like and whatever size and operations you like. It's essentially taking water around the delta. Have a combination of through the delta and around the delta, which you might call dual conveyance. And, of course, the last logical alternative is not have any water exports at all. Make people use water from other water sources, or make them do without. There's some economic cost to that and some social cost as well. To all these things, actually, as we've seen. So we want to evaluate. We're not just here to sort of tell the world that it has problems, because I think we already know that. We're not here to just present the world with these 4 alternatives, because we know we have a range of alternatives, but we're also here to sort of independently and hopefully with not too much passion evaluate these and compare these alternatives with respect to a set of criteria. So we, in a moment of supreme bravery, chose the Delta Vision co-equal objectives. It was a lot easier to choose someone else's objectives than to make up your own. And the first of these is the Delta ecosystem, which Delta Vision calls a sustainable environment. And as Peter reported yesterday, we modify this to be a little bit more scientific, to call it viability of native fish populations. And as he discussed and Bill Bennett discussed yesterday, we used their supreme expert judgment, as well as the expert judgments of many other people, to help us estimate the performance of these alternatives, these strategies, or the range of performance for these strategies, I should say, with respect to this objective. And then with regard to water supply, Delta Vision has this idea of a reliable water supply being an objective. And as we think about this, at least from the ivory tower, and I think in a very practical sense as well, we don't really care about water supply. We care about most of this water is being used for economic purposes. We care about the economic value and the economic employment of this water. For 99% of it, it's economically useful in urban settings and in agricultural settings. So for us, it seems a much more tangible and relevant statewide policy that we can put numbers on and then compare in a quantitative sense is statewide economic costs. And in these economic costs, we include, of course, construction and operations of facilities, water quality costs. As you've seen in earlier presentations today, these water quality costs are surprisingly high. We can argue about the numbers, the decimal points, but these numbers are large. They're certainly large relative to our incomes, individual incomes. And water supply cutbacks. This is California. Any alternative is going to have water supply cutbacks in some years. And the relative frequency and magnitudes of water supply cutbacks to different users is of a great deal of importance. And we've looked at some of those cutbacks in the previous Appendix F that we saw yesterday. In trying to do this kind of evaluation, we're doing it in a realm that has a lot of uncertainty. We often can use uncertainty as something to caution us and sober us in our deliberations. Sometimes we use uncertainty as a reason to avoid making a decision. But it seems to us that given the nature of this problem and the relative urgency and likelihood of fairly catastrophic failures, that we should be a little bit more thoughtful and judgmental about how we employ uncertainty in this kind of analysis. And so we've chosen to represent uncertainty in a couple of different ways. One is ranges in parameter values, reasonable ranges, I should say, in these parameter values of costs and probabilities and viabilities. And also in terms of how we set up the logic of the problem. We all make mistakes. Even the government makes mistakes. Even policy makes mistakes. No matter how we deliberate, no matter how careful we are, we sometimes make mistakes. And that doesn't mean, well, sometimes that means we just don't make any decisions, but that's probably not a good strategy. The way we should normally consider the role of mistakes in decision analysis, in analyzing decision possibilities and options, is to say, well, if we make a mistake, what would we do next to try to recover from a mistake? And so one thing we've tried to do here is to incorporate that logic of, gosh, if something goes wrong, what will we do and what will be the costs of that? And then we can evaluate that in a much more comprehensive framework. So I think it's very important, considering particularly that we're moving into a new delta where we really don't know very much about what's going on, and it will be a new world in many different ways, to consider the possibility that we might make a mistake. So fish population viability, this is just to review where we get some of these numbers, at least the magnitudes of the numbers from before. This is from the survey that Bill and Peter presented yesterday. Again, notice that this range here of probabilities of different species being viable is quite wide, but never very high. Of course, what interests us here is the comparison of these four strategies. And we can see really a very persistent pattern here that ending exports always tends to be lower than, continuing through delta exports is always lower than ending exports in terms of the probability of keeping fish around. And peripheral canals and dual conveyance are somewhere in the middle. The other thing I think worth noting about this, and was mentioned earlier, I think, is that the range here is also quite wide. That how we implement a particular strategy is quite important, in many cases more important than the particular strategy we pick. It might be better to continue through delta and do it very well than to have a peripheral canal or perhaps even ending exports and do it poorly or unluckily. So there's a lot going on here. in terms of the economic evaluation, this is where we have a little bit more complexity. Maybe because it's easier to estimate numbers here allows us to do a little more complex analysis. This is a decision tree, which allows us to lay out the logic of a decision problem in a structured way. And I'm not sure how many of you have seen this before, this kind of approach before, but the way we do it is at the far left-hand side, you start with an initial decision that you have to make. And you have the options. Each branch is an option for that initial decision. And here, of course, we have peripheral canal, dual facility, ending water exports, continuing through delta exports. And then following that decision, you often have a chance event. You get lucky, you get unlucky, you're right, you're wrong. In the case of a peripheral canal, what if you build a peripheral canal and the fish recover? Oh, well, that's good. We have to pay for that peripheral canal. What happens if the fish don't recover and we have a peripheral canal? Well, we still have to pay for that thing. You know, you built it, you bought it, you got to pay for it. But the canal is not going to perform as well as we would ideally like, and there will be less exports, and there will be a cost of those reductions in exports. And we can use the modeling analysis we did with Calvin and other sources of estimates to estimate what those costs of reduced exports would be. We have a similar thing going on with dual conveyance. If the fish recover, if this dual conveyance or peripheral canal somehow changes the conditions in the delta to alleviate the concerns for the endangered species, then things go pretty well. We have to pay for a peripheral canal portion of the dual conveyance, but we also have to pay for the through delta portion. And then if the fish don't recover, we still have to pay for those things, and we have reduced exports. Ending water exports, that's the simplest on this tree because there's no chance events. We just wash our hands of this nasty delta and go our own merry way, albeit at some cost of ending exports. And you saw yesterday how we made those estimates and that range of estimates. Continuing with through delta exports is the most complex of these branches. It's the most vulnerable in many ways to uncertainties, I think. First of all, we have an uncertainty of sea level rise. We know the sea level is rising. That's pretty much an established fact for 10,000 years. It's going to continue to rise, but we're not quite sure of the rate. But we can come up with a probability distribution of that range of rates. For each different level of sea level rise, that has some effect, albeit perhaps small, on the rate of failure and the probability distribution of the year in which we see our first big, large-scale failure of delta islands. When those islands fail, and we will have, it's really a matter of life insurance probability rather than will it fail or will it never fail. It's like someday J. Lund will fail. It's just a matter of time. So we could have the earthquake tonight, tomorrow. We could have it 100 years from now. But there will be a time when we will have a large earthquake hit this area. This is California, after all. When that happens, we will have another choice to make. How do we want to respond after that major catastrophic event? Do we want to end water exports, build a peripheral canal, or continue with through delta exports, repairing and recovering and going on through that again? Each of these branches has costs, each of which is discounted for that time to failure and weighted by that probability. So what you do on these branches is you take these costs. When you get to a decision juncture, you take the cheapest one, unless you want to have some non-economic behavior and pick a more expensive one, but that's certainly your choice. I generally try to pick the cheapest one. And then you go to the probability nodes here, and you take all of those costs from each of those branches, weight them by the probability of that branch, and then bring it back until you take it back, those numbers, those costs essentially, of all the uncertainties and all the follow-up decisions back to the initial decision, the root of the decision tree, if you will. And then you can evaluate peripheral canal, dual facility, ending water exports, or continuing through delta exports overall. Continue incorporating the uncertainties and how you would respond, to the uncertainties in the future. So to populate this calculation, we reduced this very, very complex problem, and I don't want to minimize the complexity of this problem, but I do want to organize the complexity of this problem into an answerable question. Science is, after all, trying to pose things as answerable questions, not pose them as unanswerable questions. I think we can reduce this problem for this particular question of delta export strategy, long-term strategy, to 16 questions. And there's certainly going to be uncertainty in answering each of these questions, and so I'll give them 32 answers with a low and a high. So for sea level rise by the year 2050, and we'll do this for 2050 conditions. Let's say we have a low estimate here of half a foot and a high estimate of 1.5 foot. We can then look at the probabilities of extensive levee failure, delta levee failure, with the minimum level of sea level rise, a low and a high, maximum level of sea level rise, a low and a high, population viability of 2050 for delta smelt, or in parentheses, Chinook salmon for year 2050. So probability with continued through delta exports, probability with no delta exports, with a peripheral canal, dual conveyance, again, ranges of numbers very similar to the table before. I want to take this opportunity to point out here that you'll notice these numbers are not exactly the numbers we get from the surveys. And I think you'll see also that some of our numbers are not exactly the same as what came out of modeling results. And that's because we believe all the models are wrong. Any model will be wrong. And it's important, particularly for decision analysis and public decision making, to think about the numbers before you use them. And so this provides us an opportunity to take those numbers, think about them with our professional judgment experience, talking with people and say, well, do we think that number's a little high, a little low? And to put down a number that doesn't give an undue level of precision. You know, if I'd sort of taken directly from the surveys, I would have an undue level of precision on some of these numbers as well. So there's several reasons why we don't take modeling results straightforward. That it's we don't want to be lazy about this. People just that take model results directly, it's kind of a form of laziness, I think. Although sometimes I like to be lazy. Percent of exports reduced with continued through delta pumping. So this is how much less than, say, pre-Ranger levels of exports are you going to have if we continue to take water through the delta. And we have an estimate range here between 25 and 40%, sort of roughly Ranger-esque levels, perhaps a little bit high here, a little bit low here. And then if you have a peripheral canal, the fish don't recover. What long-term levels of exports will you have? And we figured that's probably about the same thing. And when people can argue scientifically, if you change the peripheral canal location and the fish don't recover, doesn't that mean that, does that mean anything about the causal tie between exports and fish population decline? I don't really think we're going to opine on that, because I don't think it really matters. The judges are likely to cut that exports by about that amount anyway, and so for the decision analysis, that's really what these numbers represent. They don't represent any physical scientific tie between the well-being of these fish and a peripheral canal. They represent, well, what we think at this juncture, how the legal system is going to respond and the regulatory system is going to respond. And we figure that they'll respond similarly to the way they'll respond to through delta. It's just a matter of being practical about this decision making here. I got to quit dropping the ends because it sounds too Sarah Palin-esque. Economic and financial costs. So we have a range of construction costs for a peripheral canal. We've got additional water quality costs from continuing to use delta waters, and so you've seen from the just previous two appendices where we get these ranges of numbers. What the annualized costs are for ending delta exports. Those numbers come largely from the Calvin modeling yesterday, that were presented yesterday. The annualized cost to maintain through delta pumping, so that's keeping levees going and things like that. These are all the details of these are explained in Appendix J. We have a paragraph or a page or so on each of these numbers. Costs to water users of a sudden extensive failure of delta levees, roughly between $8 and $15 billion. Average cost to repair an extensive levee failure, and with what exponent, so the most cryptic of these questions is what exponent relates export reductions to economic cost. And you might recall from Appendix F presentation yesterday that we talked about estimating those exponents from the different Calvin results. So just to show you that these appendices were done with some malice of forethought, along with this Appendix J. Here's the different appendices and different sources where we got most of these numbers from. So Appendix B was used to estimate most of these, or it was most thoroughly discussed here, that relies on other estimates from different folks in the literature. Appendices D and E are the major source of discussion for these. These are, I think, just our own professional judgments, informed by model runs that were done by DWR and Metropolitan and a bunch of other people on the effects of the Wanger decision on exports. Similar thing for PC export reductions. We just took the through Delta for the most part. For the construction costs, we rely on Department of Water Resources and Delta Vision estimates, fairly high and low. Additional water quality costs from using Delta water. You saw those presentations just now. Appendix F is the major source for this range of estimates of the cost of ending Delta exports. Appendix B has costs in there for keeping levees alive through Delta pumping. And DREAMS was the major, did a wonderful set of studies, I think, on costs of catastrophic levee failures in the Delta and the cost of recovery for that. We relied on those estimates for the most part. And then F, again, for the exponents on relating percentage of export reductions to the percentage of no export cost that you should include in this. So then the way this all falls out is with for each alternative, for the range of economic costs for through Delta exports ranges between about $550 million a year and about, I think, $1.8 billion per year. Pretty wide range. The likelihood of fish viability was between, I think, 5% and 30% for Delta smelt. This is for maintain self-supporting populations, so getting off the endangered species list. Ending exports is the best thing you could do for these fish, but it comes at a higher cost. Improvement for fish viability goes up to 30 to 60%, and the overall costs go between about $1.5 and $2.5 billion per year. Annualized cost of all those things put together. For a peripheral canal, has costs much lower, between about $250 million a year and about $0.86 billion per year. Improves the probability of fish viability to be about 10 to 40%. So it does better than through Delta. It's almost certain to do better than through Delta with regard to both objectives. But it's no exports is likely to do better for fish, although at a higher cost. And then for dual conveyance, in terms of fish, we considered, dual conveyance. It gives you some additional flexibility, but you're still taking water from the Delta. If you were really smart and lucky, you might do better than peripheral canal in terms of fish because you can alternate between intakes. But on the other hand, we're not always smart about the way we operate these things. And we might think we're doing a good job, or we might get in a hurry and take water through the Delta when it's not good for fish. And so you might actually do worse. So on balance, we felt it's probably about the same as peripheral canal for fish. So it has the same range between 10 and 40%. But on the cost side, it's going to cost more because you've got another set of infrastructure you're investing in. It's going to cost more. And depending upon how extensive the dual part of the dual conveyance is, affects the cost quite a lot. So if you have sort of a minimalist dual conveyance where you take the existing intakes and you sort of keep them along for a while until some time out, that doesn't cost you so much. But if some of the proposals we saw were essentially building a peripheral canal and a through Delta canal, and that adds quite a lot of cost. So that gives the range of costs on dual conveyance. Dual conveyance is also, I think, very hard for us to think about because we haven't, people in general have not done very much in the way of cost studies or benefit studies for dual conveyance to the degree that you can pin numbers down with any confidence. So overall, for delta smelt, you can make your own judgment. This is the range of where we think the performance is likely to be for the two co-equal objectives. If you liked fish only and not money, you would go with ending exports. It's pretty straightforward. If you viewed these as co-equal objectives, it's almost certain you would go with a peripheral canal of some sort. It's not to say how you would operate it, but it is to say that if you want to have any significant exports of water from the delta, in the long run, you will want to have a peripheral canal. You might be interested in what about this for other fish. So this is Chinook salmon, a very different kind of fish. A lot bigger fish, at least to my engineering mind. More edible fish. The boxes are a little different size, a little different location, but they have the same basic arrangement. You know, the geometry of this solution hasn't changed with the fish. I should also mention, lest these numbers seem too pessimistic, that the viability here was seen not as viability of a self-sustaining population, but viability of recreational and commercial fishing. So it's a little less tight here for Chinook salmon. So that's sort of the second major, if we have three major messages, I think, for our report so far, the first would be this delta is going to change. You're going to see more salt and large areas of open water, sea level rise. The second is, if you want to have significant amounts of exports out of the delta in the long run, you're going to want to have a peripheral canal. The third point to me is, look at the difference between peripheral canal and no exports. First of all, it doesn't do as well for fish. Second of all, it does a lot better economically, on the order of $1 billion or so a year. Surely somebody can think of something to do with $1 billion a year that might be good for fish, better for fish than what we would do otherwise. So maybe we can take some of that surplus, economic surplus, that we get from having a peripheral canal, invest that in fish, and make up a new alternative up here. Call it peripheral canal plus plus. We have some ability to pay here. In principle, there's a willingness to pay, even if it's not a willingness to reveal a willingness to pay. Right? We can't expect people to express a willingness to pay, but the theory and the numbers indicate that there is one there, ultimately. And so this, I think, is where the real discussion should be. Not should we have a peripheral canal or not, but how can we try to make use of this economic surplus to improve our long-term management. This is a very difficult problem, of course. We've solved the problem that probably is most talked about, but it only leads us into another long series of discussions, as we'll talk about after lunch. I was going to put the spreadsheet here, but I'll do that afterwards because they won't have it on the web, so I'll continue on. So conclusions overall. The delta is inevitably going to be more saline, more open water for any export strategy. So those web-tracked folks, I mean, that's going to happen no matter what. These changes are going to harm water users, but are likely going to be better for fish, especially if we can remove the export pumps that, as have been demonstrated, cause such harm to the fish. Peripheral canal seems to be best for co-equal fish and water supply objectives, but of course no exports is best for the fish alone. And sort of a methodological conclusion that might be useful for setting up future science kinds of things. An understandable quantitative framework can help provide insights from diverse technical knowledge, including reasonable ranges of uncertainty. I have to confess that really all of the appendices that you've seen presented the last 2 days were organized and followed through to fit into this kind of framework. So at every step of the way, this was not shotgun science where you just have studies of all possible things and at the end you step back and you try to draw insights. We haven't had a lot of success with that. We've learned a lot from that, certainly, but we haven't it hasn't been able to bring us a lot of insights that are useful, I think, for policy people yet. And so this was an attempt to try to take some of those scientific efforts, take advantage of a lot of excellent science that's gone on in the past, and add some to it. I think you've seen a lot of new things in these appendices that have not been done or certainly not been published before. And to bring this together in a framework that was designed to work together. So we designed these pieces so they would fit together to give us a logical way to work through this question, this decision question. In terms of a peripheral canal, some thoughts on how you might want to do it. And maybe I'll stray a little bit into Ellen's talk, not too much, I hope. First is export users need to commit up front to pay for facilities. Looking around, we don't see a lot of money in the state. We don't see a lot of money in the federal government. I don't have a lot of money as individuals. You don't either. The money for this system will have to come from beneficiaries. Other people that benefit from this system are not only the export water users, but also some upstream diverters. And I think this is something that the Delta Vision folks have also noticed after they read our first report. We've also noticed, and I think quantified, probably for the first time in a broad way, the water quality savings that a peripheral canal provides. It's not just that we're providing them with better water supply reliability, we're providing with better water. So there's two big sources of economic benefits for the water users, both export users and upstream. A really interesting question came up when we first presented our results. I'll have to acknowledge PCL for coming up with this great question. They noted that it's probably important to distinguish whether you're going to build, if you build a peripheral canal, do you start it with full exports amounts, or do you allow it to begin only with the amount of exports you're currently allowing through the delta? And I think the math doesn't change for all of this because this looks at a 2050 equilibrium condition. But it is important in terms of keeping the incentives straight for all the players in the system. And I think also in terms of the political palatability of these decisions. So I think our recommendation here would be to expand peripheral canal diversions as the fish recover. So you would start off with some kind of post-wanger diversion quantities, and then as the fish recovered, you could perhaps expand diversions. The other thing we found, and Bill Fleener is largely responsible for much of this, not to limit the physical capacity of this canal arbitrarily. There's a lot of benefits from having a fairly large canal that can take water in wet years and less water in dry years, and that can vary its operation over the course of a tidal cycle so that you don't have to worry so much about flood tides causing reverse flows up the Sacramento River. And so all the guarantees you want to have on environmental performance and water right performance for Northern California, you really would like to do this by governance, and I think Ellen will talk about some possible ownership safeguards that we've been developing, and others have been developing as well, I should add. And then I think in addition, noting, coming back again to notice that with no exports, you have the highest probability of the fish doing well compared to having any exports at all. That we should use the peripheral canal benefits, again, beneficiary pays kind of things in terms of the exporters and perhaps upstream diverters, to fund many of the environmental improvements that Peter and Bill identified yesterday. So with that, I'm done. Have any questions? It's all perfectly clear or perfectly obtuse. I can't decide.
When you were putting together your decision tree, because I noticed in your decision tree you didn't have ecosystem in there at all in terms of...
Oh, they have their own axis. See, this is a different axis.
No, but the restoration is what I mean. You didn't have restoration costs in the decision tree at all, the economic costs. I don't see ecosystem restoration in there. You mentioned it at the end.
Right.
But did you think about trying to put it into the decision tree at all?
We did, and I couldn't think of a clear way to represent it. I figured we should represent, the fish with their own own axis, and I think if the fish don't recover, you might add additional costs, but they're going to be scattered everywhere, and they'll be pretty high. They need to be high in any regard. I think maybe we take a step back from it and just sort of make that blanket statement that no matter what we do with these, we're going to have fairly high expenditures for the environment, and I wouldn't want to get into discussions over how much less will it be if you build a peripheral canal and the fish recover. I don't, it seems premature for us to have that discussion at this point. I would agree that might even be a non-trivial difference, but I think in either regard, we're going to have substantial amounts of environmental investments we would want to make in this system for a long time. So, if I made a distinction here about how much difference I'd have in environmental costs between fish recovering and not recovering with a peripheral canal, that seemed, to my simplistic mind, that seems overly speculative, but potentially important.
Yeah. Well, and my guess is that the experts who did their viability estimates used their own assumptions
Right.
around that you don't
Right.
know what those assumptions
Right.
were. Yeah.
Jay, I was curious about a little follow-up on some of your costing information for conveyance. Richard presented 2,000, 7,500, and 15,000 CFS conveyance systems as having various effects on the salinity, and your recommendations are to go with the larger capacity, and you had estimates of $4.8 to about $9.8 billion for the building of such a conveyance system. Could you tell me about how sizing is going to affect that cost? Is it a substantive difference or not?
There are a lot of economies of scale in these things. The first thing you have to do is acquire a right-of-way, and you have to acquire ability to access that right-of-way. And so the size of the canal isn't going to affect, it's going to affect the width of that right-of-way some, but you've already gone through most of all the mitigations and things like that. 90% of it or so you're going to have to do almost regardless of the size of the canal. So I don't think that the size of the canal is going to have many billions of dollars of difference in the cost. Perhaps Paul, who probably follows these estimates more closely than I do, would have a better sense of it. But the high number we have is, I think, for a very large canal, and the small number is probably for a smaller one. But I think there's more uncertainty in the cost of acquiring that right-of-way and doing a small project than the difference in cost between small and large. Paul, do you have anything to add on that?
I just wondered if some of the, was the higher end a dual conveyance? Or was
No,
strictly
that was a peripheral.
isolated?
That was it's the other alignment.
Oh, the western.
Western alignment.
Okay.
So 9.75 is going to
Right.
I must say that dealing with where I spend most of my day dealing with large construction costs, 4.75 billion doesn't sound like too much by any means for the eastern alignment for a large facility with all the land rights and the easements and the relocations and those kinds of things. Doesn't seem too big at all.
Well, it's supposed to be the lower bound.
Yeah.
You're closer to Washington.
I don't know. I mean, people can spend $100,000 doing cost estimates on these kinds of things, and we're not going to do that.
Did you do sensitivity analyses?
Oh, you can do that. Maybe this is a.
Good time for the spreadsheet.
I'll put the spreadsheet up.
You can do it yourself.
For those that are on the web, you can download this spreadsheet from the PPIC website, and you can play your own sensitivity analysis games, but I just ask that you do the same level of documentation of your numbers and peer review of your numbers. That's all.
That was 42 peer reviews?
Not every appendix had 42 reviewers. They all each of them had at least 3, I think, though. I forgot to download the spreadsheet on here. Let's see if I can get an Excel spreadsheet to work on the web. So here's the range of numbers, and this will be the results page. So the spreadsheet has a page of introduction and instructions, a set of the inputs, along with a figure at the bottom that it lets you look at. There's a little box plot. So what would you like to do? What do you think is a more reasonable number for costs on a peripheral canal? Any brave souls?
Well, maybe you could just explain to me how the model or how the spreadsheet, does it just use those different ranges, or does it sample betwing those?
No, it
between
uses the
or-
range.
It does each end of the range to make
Yeah.
the box, because some of the things are described as a probability distribution,
Yes.
which kind of implies to me that you sample across the probability
and
distribution,
indeed,
or
for,
you just use because
for
it's
the in the branches on the tree, where we have the chance constraint, the chance
Yes.
nodes,
Yes.
those are sampled across the range. So those are essentially analytically or numerically integrated. For the ranges here and the parameter values, we take the extremes. So when we have the upper bounds and lower bounds on the costs, particularly through delta, where we have a lot of different costs, we're taking the highest of the high, all the highs and all the lows. So you don't get lucky. The highs is you get very, very unlucky with every turn, and the lows is you get very, very lucky with every turn. So those kinds of things. Although I think for some of these things, they actually probably are correlated perversely that way. If you're going to get unlucky, you'll probably get unlucky in several ways. You can change the discount rate and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, why don't we change the discount rate? I was going to suggest that, actually. Yeah, let's change the discount rate.
What do you think is a good discount rate? You want to see 3%?
Yeah. I don't know what's a good one, but let's...
Muni bonds right now, tax-free, are 1%.
Okay, but we're not going to. This is a long-term discount rate
Yeah,
we need.
but- but
This is
let's
not.
take it- let's take
This
it.
is not get lucky on your bond issuing discount rate. So there you go.
So, it changed?
Yeah.
Sure, it changed. Costs go down. Capital costs go down.
You'll have to guide me what I'm looking at to see what
Here's the
changed.
box.
I'm sorry, you look at this all the time. You don't.
Split the screen so you can see the chart and the change at the same time.
Oh, good idea. All right. So now we go up here.
All the time.
Yeah, right.
3%. Okay, now we're going to 5%.
Okay.
3%. Oh, I did something wrong here.
You see, no exports doesn't change. That doesn't change.
No, because that's already annualized. Right. Anything else?
Let's change sea level rise.
Oh. Well, sea level rise, remember, these are going to affect, when you change the sea level rise, you're going to have to change what your estimates are of the high and low probabilities of failure. Okay? So this number isn't actually used
But in the
directly.
spreadsheet, they're independent?
Well,
Or is
You-
there
you
is
have
there
to
is
have-
there a set probability distribution?
no.
For the
You're-
failure based
you're
on the sea level
establishing
rise
the
rate.
range of failure for the minimum sea level rise here. It actually doesn't care what the minimum you put here is. What it really cares about is how you think the probability of failure changes. Yeah, that would be perverse. So
I'm sorry, I'm not sure why that would be perverse.
well,
but-
because what you really care about in terms of the cost is the probabilities of failure. Yeah, it would be complicated, and it
don't
would
think
be,
they really
it would obscure, so here what's really important in the calculations is this, the tie in the analyst's mind, which hopefully is more complex than my spreadsheet, or any spreadsheet, with what you think the probability of failure is with the high and the low sea level rise. So if you think that there's your lower bound is 0, that's not going to change anything. But if I think with a lower bound of 0 that I also have 1% chance of extensive failure, that will change things. Not very much, but it did. Okay?
So is anything linked to sea level rise? Is the water quality treatment cost or anything linked to that?
No. No.
Okay. So you could change that and nothing's linked to it in the model or in the spreadsheet.
Well, I mean, it's important in terms of the logic of thinking through it. You know, as you set this number, hopefully in your filling out the form, that will inform you as to, okay, what level of sea level rise is going to affect that probability of extensive failure with that minimum sea level rise. So the questions are, this is the only one that behaves that way, that perverse way, if you will. But the purpose of the questions is also to lead people through the logic of the problem.
Logic marker.
Yeah. So.
Jay, make the canal much more expensive.
Yeah, double the canal.
All right. Let's make this 20.
Like William Shatner and Priceline.
There you go. 20 billion.
That's up the lower end too. Make that 10.
There you go. All of a sudden we have less surplus for the fish.
Something costs that much.
All of a sudden we have less surplus for the fish. But it's still cheaper. And it's still better than through Delta.
Which elements change the cost on no exports?
The no export cost.
Okay.
Question 12 or
Yeah, question 12. 1.5 to 2.5.
So we just
That's it.
have the cost. We can't change a driver of that cost.
You have
it's
to go
the
back and
absolute-
do some more modeling.
Okay.
I mean, the purpose of the spreadsheet was to summarize the appendices, not to. I mean, we could have maybe I could have a button here that would run Calvin or something.
It's got to fit on one little paragraph.
In principle, one could do that. Any other questions? You want to redo this analysis? We can do this. It's kind of fun. We did a lot of this. Boy, when we were making the spreadsheet, we passed this thing around and we try to kick it all over the place.
Let's change one of the fish viabilities.
Those are also very direct. You know,
Right.
what you type
They're
back
just
here
going to
goes directly-
change the size of the box directly.
It also changes
Or do
the likelihood of fish recovery.
Okay. So
It does have some effect that way.
It's going to so it changes the costs in terms of the what you have to do relative to fish.
Yeah, the risk of
Right?
recovery.
If I've done it correctly, right?
Jay, change the Wanger decision.
Change the
So
Wanger
the percentage cutbacks.
Yeah.
Oh,
Right here. Okay.
It's
Do you want
89.
So what do you think it's? Paul, you're from Metropolitan. What do you think it is?
Make the peripheral canal less.
Less. So if the fish decline, you think the new Judge Wanger is going to be nicer to you? So what do you think? What do you think the range?
Rationale, but we're playing games here now.
Oh yeah, that's all right. 10 to 20%.
20.
One of the things that enticed me into doing this analysis was I sat down and did a very simple decision analysis that had like 4 boxes to it, where I looked at, do you have a peripheral canal or through delta, and it seemed to me at the time that my first cut was if the fish recovered, it was all fine. You just paid for the peripheral canal, and if the fish didn't recover, you got no exports at all. So you got nothing. You paid for that investment, and you got nothing out of it. It's like no exports. And it still came out of my first sort of doodling on this that it only had to be about a 25% probability that the fish would recover. And it was still worthwhile compared to through delta. And it's very primitive, back-of-the-envelope doodling. And that indicated to me that the structure of this problem might lend itself to having some insights fall out of this.
Can you change the exponent that we use for reduction in seasonal costs?
Yeah. I'm going to try to do one of these things at a time here. So this export. So if I make this linear, I'll make the lower bound linear, and that way we'll see.
Works the same.
Yeah,
Okay.
and you can see there. So there, that's important.
We start to get some overlap there.
Yeah.
Well,
Oh,
no,
yeah.
no exports has been plotting removed from the other boxes. There hasn't been any overlap, and so I'm just trying to see how you get that. So can you just explain the mechanisms behind that for me? Why is that making that difference? What's going on there? Can somebody just
Oh, sure.
walk
So
me through the economic steps there?
If you are a farmer
Yes.
and you have crops, a mix of crops and all kinds of stuff on your fields, and you're asked to reduce your water use by 20%. Are you going to go out and randomly kill 20% of your crops? No, you're going to instead of when you get an allocation of 20% less of water, you're going to say, well, what are my most profitable crops on my best soils? I'm going to irrigate them just as I would before. And I'm going to take that 20% hit out of my least profitable crops on my least productive soils. And so for a 20% hit on your water deliveries, you'll see much less than 20% economic cost.
Okay.
But when you get that last 10% hit, that's going to take out all your most profitable stuff.
Okay, so when that was 1, then it was just 20%, 20%.
I just
Okay.
took out
Thank
crops
you.
randomly.
Thank you.
People are smarter than that usually.
I understand.
And one of the interesting things is that you don't really get any significant increase in those costs until you reduce exports quite a bit, right? I mean, we have to get down.
I'm sure individual farmers
Sure.
will.
No, but overall to the economy, and
Right.
that's in part because the urban sector really does basically manages in ways that don't reduce their water availability very much until you get down to sort of the no export type situation.
Calvin has trading built in, both these things. And so when you look at the effect of this, you'll see a lot of trades coming out of the Sacramento Valley, say, where the agriculture is relatively less profitable than other places. And so we're not looking at the regional impacts here, and the regional impacts can vary tremendously.
One of the, I think, useful things about this, and we kick this around a lot. We farmed the various, probably 100 versions of the spreadsheet out to the authors, and everybody kicked it around a bit. And it takes a lot to fundamentally rearrange the geometry of these boxes. You have to be really, really optimistic, really, really pessimistic on different things in almost magical ways to rearrange those boxes. So we had a lot of big surprises come out of this study, and to me, probably the most surprising thing was how stable this is. How stable the arrangement of these boxes are. I never expected to be able to give have a report that said we'll have a peripheral canal. I really never expected to be able to state that as a robust conclusion. I mean, and we even went to the if you go into the Appendix J, we even went to calculate the probability of Pareto optimality of things like this between these alternatives, because you can see that there's some overlap here between through delta and peripheral canal. So, gosh, there is some probability that through delta could get really lucky and be up here, and peripheral canal could get really unlucky and be down here. But it's like a 1% chance of that happening. So, whereas it's about a 70% chance that you'll do better with a peripheral canal on both objectives than you will with through delta.
Did you anywhere in any of the appendices or the model take into account, I know yesterday with the levy talk and property values, one of the next steps was to take into account the cultural values or whatever the term was. But I'm wondering if where the in-delta interests are taken into account, those that live in the delta and those values, are they taken into account?
There are only two co-equal objectives that we stole from Delta Vision.
So those were not taken into account?
Well, okay, they were taken into account in the sense that that's a different decision. I mean, how does your operation of the delta for water supply affect those interests? You know,
Jay,
in this long-term delta where you have earthquakes and you've already had these floods occur.
in the cold, hard economists' world, they were taken into account because we took into account the losses in the delta versus the losses in the valley. Now, if you're going to tell me that a loss of a farming operation in the delta has a greater cultural value than a loss in the farming operation in the Central Valley, I will say, okay, by how much? What's the index? And by the way, have you talked to the person in the Central Valley about this? We treated them both the same. So if we're measuring a job is a job. Although, and a dollar is a dollar. Now, that might be insensitive and inaccurate, but to do this sort of clarity and simplicity, we have to do it. And then we modify.
Right.
But in terms of jobs and money and water and the environment, it is a totally impartial balance. We're neither penalizing the delta or favoring them.
Yep, I think there's sort of two aspects of this. The main one, I think, is that this delta is going to change one way or the other, and most of the impacts that we foresee being inevitable really disentangle the well-being of the in-delta economy from water exports. There'll be some small effects, I think, in the South Delta, but largely the Central Delta, you know, probably 50 to 100,000 acres of islands there, they're going to go underwater anyway in this kind of time frame.
Sea level rise is not a decision variable.
Right.
in this
Earthquakes
model.
are not decision variables. Those would be sunk costs.
Literally.
Any other questions? I don't want to be the speaker between you and lunch, so eat, drink, and be merry. And we'll start up again at 1:00.